At this point, Socrates introduces a new image, which is the divided line. It's called the divided line. He says, make a line and divide it in unequal portions, so one part longer than another, and then divide each of those portions in the same ratio. So I've tried to do that in the slides here, and I'm not sure it's technically perfectly correct, but just visually I tried to do that. And he says that will give us 4 portions on this line. Now these 4 portions are in increasing, sort of ascending order of closeness to true understanding or full knowledge. Okay, they're kind of ascending order from the sensible, the purely sensible, to the pure forms, and what would be the best kind of knowledge, including knowledge of the good. So knowledge of the form of the good is going to be way over on the, so going to be way over on one side of the line, and knowledge of sensible things is going to be way over on towards the imagination side of the line. So what belongs, or what are we talking about in each of these portions of the line? Socrates gives some examples. In the imagination portion, Socrates says we have images in pools of water, and mirages and dreams. So the imagination section is going to include basically different kinds of experiences that are not really fully substantive and real, but are rather just reflections or images. Shadows will be included here. Okay, so these are images that we experience in the sensible world, but don't actually correspond to a substantive thing, you could say. Okay, in the next portion, the sense portion, we have actual substantive objects like an individual horse or an individual person or a rock and so on. Okay, so like if a rock makes a shadow when the sun hits it, the shadow is part of the imagination portion, but the rock is part of the sense portion. Likewise, if you have like you're sort of looking at a horse that itself is looking down at a pool of water, and you look at the reflection of the horse in the water. The reflection of the horse in the water is part of the imagination section, but the horse itself is part of the sense section. Why is it part of the sense section? Because we know that individual horse by sensation, by seeing it, by sensing it. Okay. The next portion of the line begins really a sort of a big shift. There's a big shift between the first 2 portions and the second 2 portions, a big division. The thought portion of the line begins the intelligible section. Okay, and the intelligible section is going to cover both thought and understanding. The thought portion, this is again the 3rd portion in the divided line. This characterizes any like actually most sciences, and an example that Socrates uses is geometry. So in geometrical sciences, he says we use hypotheses to derive certain conclusions. And he says, notice that the relation, just like the relation between like a horse and an image of a horse in water, as is captured between portion 2, the sense portion, and the imagination portion. In the same way, there's a correlation between the hypotheses that that geometers use, people are doing geometry, and the ideas that they're representing by those hypotheses. Maybe a clearer way to put this is there's a relation between the images that geometers use and their hypotheses, or the points that they're making with those images. So, when you do geometry, you draw a triangle, right? Or you draw a square or circle, you draw a line, you draw 2 lines, and you do some reasoning about those things. But you're not studying that individual triangle. You're not studying that individual circle. What you're trying to do is you're trying to use an image to help you get at universal truths or eternal truths. You're trying to use an image to make to discover something or learn something about all triangles, about all circles. Or another way to put it is you're trying to learn something about triangles as such, not just this triangle, but any triangle, or not just this isosceles triangle, but any isosceles triangle. Okay, so whatever the images are that you make of a figure of a certain kind, in geometry you're using those images as a means to make claims about more general things. So in this portion of the line, I should say Plato by this point, because these are really Plato's ideas. Plato would say this portion of the line is dealing with forms, okay? But it's dealing with forms only through images. So it's like we use an image that falls in the sensation category, or the sense category. We use that image as a kind of scaffolding to get at what the forms are like. And we're sort of operating in that way, where we're operating a lot with images, but we're trying to use the images to talk about and learn about forms. Now, in the final portion, the understanding portion, we access the forms directly. One way he puts it is we move from forms through forms alone. From forms to forms through forms alone. So this is like the highest kind of knowledge, and it's here where it becomes possible to access the form of the good. What's the discipline or field that deals with the forms in this last portion? What's the discipline or field that deals with forms themselves? That deals with forms directly, that moves from forms to forms through forms alone? It's philosophy. Okay, so this is why the guardians, the ones who will be the most wise in society and will lead the society, ought to be philosophers, according to Plato. They ought to study philosophy because they need to study philosophy in order to be able to access the truest, deepest kind of knowledge, which is understanding, this last portion of the divided line. They need philosophy to be able to access the forms themselves, to know things in the best way they can be known, or the most thorough way they can be known, which is in terms of their forms. And they also need that knowledge to know the sort of most important of the forms, which is the form of the good. The only way to access this form of the good in terms of knowledge, the only way to come to know the form of the good, or to approximate to knowledge of the form of the good, because it might be actually really hard to know it perfectly, but to even get close to it, you have to be able to move beyond these three earlier kinds of knowledge. You have to be able to move beyond just imagination, just sensation, just thought in the form of like the sciences and math and geometry, specific disciplines of study. You have to be able to move beyond those to the kind of knowledge that we have in philosophy, which, according to Plato, is acquired primarily by dialectical discussion. One comes to learn the forms by thinking critically about the forms, or about the way that we talk about things. So one thinks critically, one questions, one doesn't settle or just assume hypotheses, but one always questions those hypotheses and asks whether or not those hypotheses really are grounded or justified. And by that kind of dialectical discussion, it's as if one is sort of testing ideas all the time by this dialectical discussion, by looking for weaknesses or problems with ideas, and gradually by doing that, one gets a better and better grasp on what these things actually are, a better and better grasp on what the beautiful actually is, on what justice actually is, and so on. And that's how we come to know the forms through doing philosophy, according to Plato.